The temperature drops and London's poorest brace for the season of suffering. Chimneys smoke like dying dragons, breath turns to fog, and misery gets a cosy new coat of frost. The year might be 1850-something, but the scene never changes. A grey sky lowering over a greyer city, and the slums waiting beneath it like a trap that's already sprung. The first frost didn't just arrive, it invaded. It crept into door frames, curled under blankets, and whispered in people's ears that it was time to suffer again. For the poor of Victorian London, winter wasn't a season, it was an enemy campaign. The middle class might wax poetic about Jack Frost and a crisp winter's morning, but in the East End, frostbite had no literary charm. It was something you caught on your toes while walking to find work that didn't exist. There was no romantic snowfall, just icy mud, frozen puddles, and fog so thick you could lose your sense of direction, or worse, your rent money, in it. Hello travellers, histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The first sign that winter had arrived was usually on the rooftops. Thin slates glazed over, and chimneys coughed black soot like sick lungs. Down below, families would press their hands against the frosted window panes, pretending to admire the ice patterns that looked like flowers, mostly because admiring them was warmer than trying to clean them off. Inside the room, you'd see your own breath before you saw breakfast. And if you were lucky, your bed wasn't frozen to the wall. The East End's poor learned to measure the cold not by the thermometer, that was a luxury item like bread, but by sound. When the puddles stopped splashing and started cracking, when rats ran quieter because their paws stuck to the ground, and when coughing became the neighbourhood chorus, that was the first frost announcing itself. And unlike polite visitors, it had no intention of leaving. Winter hit the slums hardest because they were already on life support. The thin brick walls of the lodging houses let the cold in faster than gossip. A single candle barely fought the dark, and water froze in the basin before anyone could wash. The damp crept into lungs, the chill into bones, and the despair into conversation. At least it's not raining, someone might mutter, which in London was tempting fate. Even the smells changed. The warm rot of summer gave way to the metallic tang of cold air and burning coal, if you could afford it. For most, the streets smelled of wet wool, old soot, and desperation. It wasn't unusual to see people rubbing their hands together, not for warmth, but to make sure they were still alive. The city itself seemed to change personality in winter. The Thames turned sluggish and sullen, threatening to freeze. The cobblestones gleamed with ice, making every step a gamble. Horses slipped, carts skidded, and pedestrians became impromptu ice dancers, with injuries to match. For the poor, a broken arm wasn't a funny story, it was unemployment. And unemployment in winter wasn't an inconvenience, it was a death sentence with extra frost on top. Even the light betrayed them. The days shortened cruelly, fading by mid-afternoon. What little sunshine London offered was filtered through industrial haze, more smog-grey than golden hour. By the time evening fell, the streets vanished into shadows. Gas lamps flickered uncertainly, creating more mystery than illumination. Somewhere in the dark, a man sold roasted chestnuts, and for a brief moment, the smell almost tricked you into thinking life was cosy. Almost. For many, the first frost meant an urgent scramble, not for holiday cheer, but for survival tactics. Windows were plugged with rags, floors with straw, and every crack stuffed with newspaper or hope. People who had nothing still tried to barter something, an old coat, a broken chair, a half-burned candle, because winter didn't care about pride, only endurance. And yet, there was a strange grim rhythm to it all. The frost equalized everything in a way. The rich felt it through their gloves, the poor felt it through their bones. Both watched their breath drift in the air, though only one side could afford to call it picturesque. The slums didn't romanticize survival, they just did it, day by day, frost by frost. Some writers of the time described London as enchanted under snow, like a painting. But if you asked anyone living in a cellar off Whitechapel Road, they'd say the only thing enchanted about it was how quickly your fingers went numb. The first frost marked the start of a long, brutal season, one that turned every errand into an expedition and every night into a test of nerve. The people of the slums didn't prepare for winter. They simply tightened their scarves, cursed the wind, and faced it like they always did, stubbornly, wearily, and with a dark sense of humour that somehow refused to freeze. The good news, you were alive. The bad news, so was winter, and it had your address. Morning in the East End wasn't so much about waking up as it was about realising you'd survived the night. The city hadn't yet warmed, the air still bit like it had teeth, and the first breath of the day felt like swallowing an icicle. Cracked windows leaked light and wind in equal measure. Somewhere a baby cried, somewhere else someone coughed hard enough to shake the wallpaper. Welcome to another glorious morning in Victorian London, the kind of morning that made you question your life choices and possibly your circulation. You didn't wake up in Victorian London, you defrosted. And that was no exaggeration. Bedding, such as it was, often froze stiff. Blankets doubled as curtains, rags, and occasionally family heirlooms if they lasted long enough. You'd roll out of bed, or, more accurately, roll out of a pile of shared body heat, and immediately regret every decision that led to being poor in the 1800s. The floor was a frozen battlefield of broken floorboards, leaking chamber pots, and something that might once have been bread. You wouldn't step barefoot unless you wanted frostbite or tetanus, whichever arrived first. The slum tenements were architectural miracles in the same way a drunk man balancing 3 plates is a miracle. Whole families crammed into one room the size of a pantry, and those who couldn't afford a room at all slept in hallways, stairwells, or beside the fire, assuming someone had managed to bribe the fire into existing. The walls sweated damp even in the cold, wallpaper peeled like old scabs, and the ceiling sagged as if the building itself had given up on optimism. Every breath fogged the air, and sound carried strangely through the thin wood. You could hear your neighbour snoring, another neighbour praying, and the rats having a committee meeting inside the walls. Privacy was a concept reserved for the upper class and ghosts. The smell of the slums was an unholy mixus of smoke, mildew, unwashed humanity, and breakfast, if breakfast can be defined as something vaguely edible that didn't fight back. Ah, breakfast, the most important meal of the day, if you had it. In the slums, breakfast didn't energise you, it just happened to you. Bread crusts, weak tea, or maybe porridge so thin it qualified as a beverage. Sometimes people reheated leftovers from the night before, but leftovers implied there was something left over. Still, you ate what you could. A bit of soot might fall in from the ceiling, and if you were lucky, it added flavour. Outside, the narrow alleys stirred awake. Boots clacked, horses snorted, and street vendors began shouting their daily symphony. Eels, hot pies, coal by the sack. Each sound overlapped until the street itself seemed to sing the song of survival. Children scampered out early, some to school if they were lucky, others to work if they weren't. Chimney sweeps, match girls, errand boys, little figures swallowed by the morning fog. Childhood in the slums ended the day you could hold a broom. The geography of poverty was a cruel map. The East End wasn't just poor, it was engineered for it. Narrow streets trapped the cold air and filth, while the overcrowding created a perfect environment for every disease known to science, and a few it hadn't named yet. Houses leaned against each other like drunks for support, and open drains ran down the middle of the street, freezing into glossy rivers of regret. Those lucky enough to have a job rose before dawn, trudging toward the factories, docks, or workshops. The walk to work was often longer than the meal that fueled it. Men pulled scarves over their faces to block the wind and the smell of the river, which in winter transformed from foul to weaponized. Women stayed behind to clean, sew, or look after younger siblings, though look after sometimes meant hope they don't freeze while I mend trousers. Inside every tenement, there was a rhythm. The creak of boards, the hiss of boiling kettles, the echoing coughs that blended into the background like a second heartbeat. People didn't complain much, not because they were happy, but because talking wasted warmth. Yet there was life here, stubborn and persistent. Even laughter found a way to echo between the walls, sometimes at nothing at all. Humour, like mould, thrived in damp conditions. The streets were alive by 8. Smoke hung low, the fog turned the world into a watercolour of grime, and the sound of cartwheels over cobblestones was constant. Somewhere a preacher shouted about sin, somewhere else a man sold hot potatoes out of his coat. Life in the slums was a contradiction. You were surrounded by people, but lived alone in the struggle. The community wasn't built on affection, it was built on endurance. Everyone was too tired to hate each other for long. In wealthier districts, morning began with the chime of clocks and the rustle of newspapers. In the East End, morning began with coughing, clattering, and the occasional scream. Still somehow everyone moved. Life went on because stopping meant freezing. The slum didn't offer comfort, it offered habit, and habit was sometimes enough to keep you alive. The slum awakened each morning not because it wanted to, but because it had to. Every sunrise was another chance to earn a shilling, find a crust, or simply not die. And in that daily routine, as in the scraping, shivering, and stubborn persistence, there was something almost heroic. Not the kind of heroism they wrote about in novels, but the kind that came with blistered hands and empty bellies. The good news? You'd made it through the night. The bad news? You'd have to do it again tomorrow. Even inside it's freezing. Walls are thin, roofs leak, and every draught is a personal insult. In the slums of Victorian London, stepping indoors didn't mean escaping the cold, it just meant changing its flavour. Outside, the frost nipped at your nose. Inside, it seeped into your bones. The poor had 4 seasons, damp, draughty, freezing, and technically not dead yet. Victorian houses didn't have insulation. They had character development. Every gust of wind built resilience. Every icy floorboard toughened your soul. And every collapsing roof humbled your expectations. The walls were so thin you could hear your neighbours' arguments, prayers, and chest infections in surround sound. If you were lucky, your ceiling didn't weep. If you weren't, you woke up to a drip on your forehead that had rhythm. The typical slum dwelling wasn't really built. It was assembled from leftovers. Brickwork that resembled a drunk man's Lego experiment, plaster that crumbled at the thought of weather, and windows patched with rags or newspapers to keep out the cold. The result? The cold came in anyway, but now it had something to read. At dawn, the interior temperature of most rooms hovered somewhere between meat locker and haunted crypt. People wore hats indoors, not for style but survival. Water in the basin froze solid, making washing optional, though to be fair, washing had already been optional. Condensation formed on the inside of the glass and froze in lace-like patterns, creating the illusion of beauty in a place that hadn't seen much of it. The damp was the real villain, quiet, creeping and patient. It slithered up walls, bloomed in corners, and turned bedding into sponges. Clothes hung to dry never truly dried, they just evolved into new species of mildew. The wallpaper bulged with trapped moisture, peeling away like an old scab to reveal discoloured plaster underneath. If walls could talk, these ones would cough. Inside, every surface was cold enough to qualify as an enemy. The iron bed frame bit your skin, the floor numbed your feet, and even the chair felt like sitting on punishment. Some families tried to hang blankets along the walls for extra insulation, which mostly succeeded in trapping the smell of wet wool. The furniture creaked as if it too were shivering. At night, the cold became personal. Blankets were shared, bodies pressed together, and the room filled with a symphony of snoring, coughing, and teeth chattering. Children slept in piles for warmth, like puppies, only far less adorable. Parents layered everything they owned, but the cold found its way through anyway, cunning as a tax collector. Frost formed inside the room, clinging to nails, corners, and even people's hair. You would wake up with your breath frozen to your pillow and your soul questioning its life choices. And then came the drafts. Drafts had personality in the East End. They came from under doors, through keyholes and between planks. Each one seemed to target a different body part just to keep things interesting. One hit your ankles, one whistled through your ear, and one went straight for your neck like it was settling a personal score. You'd stuff rags into every crack, shove paper into gaps, and light candles just to trick yourself into feeling warmer. It didn't work, but it gave you something to do while freezing. Even the idea of warmth was relative. Warm meant you could move your fingers. Hot meant you can smell the candle wax. Fireplaces were small and coal expensive, so many families resorted to burning anything combustible. Old furniture, trash, even dry dung. The result was less cosy hearth and more open smoke experiment. The air inside often turned thick and acrid, stinging eyes and lungs, but at least it was slightly above freezing. The good news? You were breathing. The bad news? You probably shouldn't. The smell of the indoors was unmistakable. Damp plaster, mould, smoke, and unwashed wool blended into an aroma scientists might classify as historically educational. And yet for all its misery, the home was sacred. A cold home was still your home, a small square of privacy in a world that offered none. People decorated as best they could. A Bible on the shelf, a cracked teacup holding a single candle, or a cheap print tacked to the wall depicting a warmer world. It didn't change the temperature, but it made the suffering look slightly more civilized. Visitors from higher classes sometimes ventured into the slums for charity tours, stepping delicately over puddles and marvelling at the fortitude of the lower orders. They'd remark how astonishingly stoic the poor were, as if stoicism were insulation. Then they'd go home to their drawing rooms, where fires burned bright and chairs didn't smell of damp socks. Still, the people inside those freezing rooms endured. They adapted with humour, grit, and a level of stubbornness that could outlast the frost. They didn't talk much about comfort. Comfort was a rumour. What they had instead was endurance, and that was the only warmth that never ran out. Because in the slums of Victorian London, the cold didn't just live outside, so it moved in, paid no rent, and stayed for the season. The good news? The walls still stood. The bad news? So did the icicles inside them. Fashion in the Victorian slums wasn't about looking good, it was about not dying. Every outfit was less a style choice and more a personal survival system. There were no wardrobes bursting with options, no winter collections, and certainly no dry cleaning. There was just one unbreakable rule. If you could still move, you were underdressed. The poor of London became accidental fashion pioneers of what we might now call extreme layering. A typical morning outfit involved putting on everything you owned, sometimes twice. Shirts over shirts, stockings under trousers, coats that weren't really coats, but someone else's curtains repurposed for warmth. It was less outfit coordination and more fabric panic. Victorians in the East End didn't ask, "Does this match?" They asked, "Does this itch less than hypothermia?" Clothes came from anywhere, or anyone. There was no shame in second-hand, third-hand, or even fifth-hand garments. Rag markets, pawn shops, and street vendors offered the kind of fashion that smelled like a previous owner. If your jacket had buttons from 3 different sets, it meant you were thrifty. If your coat still had a name stitched inside, you were probably wearing the legacy of someone slightly richer and possibly still alive. You could tell someone's fortune by how many holes they had per layer. The working poor wore patched trousers so thick with repairs that the original fabric was more theory than reality. Dresses were handed down until they gave up the will to exist. Gloves were a luxury, so people improvised, wrapping hands in cloth, socks, or pages torn from the Illustrated London News. There was a certain irony to staying warm by wearing yesterday's headlines. For children, the situation was even worse, and somehow more creative. Hand-me-downs flowed like water, though rarely fit as comfortably. A 10-year-old might wear a dress meant for a 6-year-old, layered over a coat meant for a grown man, held together by safety pins, string, and determination. If it didn't fit, it was simply altered by hardship. Mothers stuffed newspaper or straw into sleeves, shoes, and hats to block the wind, the original insulating filler. Londoners were practically walking scarecrows, rustling softly wherever they went. And speaking of shoes, let's use that term generously, proper boots were treasures. Many slum dwellers wore mismatched pairs or shoes so worn they resembled flaps more than footwear. Soles were patched with cardboard or rope, and if the leather tore, you stuffed rags inside and called it innovation. Some simply wrapped their feet in old cloth, tar, or even sacking from coal deliveries. Waterproofing in the East End meant try not to step in anything too deep. Of course, the damp didn't care what you wore. Rain seeped through wool, wind mocked every layer, and sleep made sure every hem stayed wet for days. Clothes were rarely washed, not out of preference but practicality. You couldn't afford to let them dry because that might take days, and you needed them on your body in the meantime. Fresh laundry was what the upper class called new fabric. For the poor, clean meant hasn't been on fire yet. Even colour was a luxury. The garments of the poor weren't the bright florals seen in fashion plates, but the dull tones of grime, soot and time. Everything faded to brown, grey or black, not because of style, but because the city itself dyed you that way. If you somehow managed to keep a white shirt white, congratulations, you were clearly a ghost. The markets on Petticoat Lane or Rag Fair were the beating heart of poor London fashion. There, clothes changed owners faster than gossip. You could buy a tattered waistcoat for a penny, or trade your old scarf for half a pair of boots. The sellers called everything gently used, which in translation meant survived a small tragedy. The keen-eyed could sometimes find old army coats or discarded servant uniforms, trophies of the upper class's cast-offs. A former butler's jacket might become a dockworker's armour against the wind. In this way, the poor quite literally wore the refuse of the rich. Men's fashion in the slums was purely utilitarian. A cap to keep your head warm, a scarf if you could find one, and coats so long they doubled as blankets. Women layered skirts until walking became an upper body workout. Petticoats, shawls and aprons, every piece added weight and warmth, and eventually a look of bulky dignity as you didn't so much stroll through Whitechapel as waddle. There were hazards, of course. Too many layers near an open flame, and you risk spontaneous combustion. Matches, lamps and stoves turned winter fashion into a fire hazard, quite literally, hot couture. Some women singed their skirts while cooking. Men burned their sleeves while lighting pipes. Warming up could be dangerously literal. Despite the indignity of it all, people made do, they mended, repurposed, and shared. A community might pull scraps of fabric to make one child a decent winter coat. Charity missions sometimes distributed old clothes, and for a day or two the streets would fill with mismatched miracles. Someone wearing a velvet waistcoat over a potato sack, or a child parading in boots 2 sizes too big and proud as a duke. And yet, amid the tattered sleeves and patched elbows, there was a strange kind of pride. These were garments that told stories of survival, of labour, of sheer stubborn endurance. Every rip had history, every stitch a memory. The poor might not have looked elegant, but they looked unbreakable. Fashion tip of 1852, wear everything you own, and if you can still move, you're underdressed. Coal was life, and also wildly expensive. In Victorian London, heat came not from hope or hugs, but from chunks of compressed geology that cost more than most people earned in a week. Coal powered everything. The factories, the lamps, the trains, and, for the poor, the desperate attempt to not freeze into a social statistic. Without it, the fire went out, the water froze, and so did you. Coal wasn't just a fuel, it was survival packaged in black dust. The wealthy burned it in elegant fireplaces trimmed with marble. The poor, meanwhile, stared longingly at the smoke drifting from chimneys like it was a taunt from heaven. For slum families, every winter began with the same calculation. How many days can we go before we can't feel our feet? The coal market in London was a monstrous thing, built on ships, sweat and sandal. Coal came from northern mines, hauled by barge down the Thames, taxed, weighed and resold through a network of middlemen who ensured the price rose faster than body heat. By the time it reached Whitechapel or Limehouse, a sack of coal could cost a day's wages. Warmth in the East End became a luxury item. For the poorest, there were 3 options: beg, borrow, or scavenge. Begging meant lining up at the coal yard, hat in hand, hoping for pity or charity coal and tiny handfuls handed out by missions and churches. Borrowing was laughable. No one had enough to spare, and scavenging, that was an art form. Children and old women picked through the dust heaps outside gasworks, hunting for small fragments of coal that had fallen from carts or been dumped as waste. These were called cinders, and though they barely burned, they were precious. A good day's haul might fill a bucket. A bad day filled your lungs with soot. The coal men, meanwhile, were minor deities in the hierarchy of survival. Big, blackened figures lugging sacks across their backs, shouting prices in the street. They delivered to anyone who could pay, and occasionally to those who couldn't, though at a steep markup. A few might take pity, leaving behind the smallest handfuls for children who followed them barefoot, hoping for coal droppings. Londoners even developed slang for these scavengers: cinder pickers, dustmen's wives, and clinker kids. Their job description: keep moving and don't inhale too deeply. And then there were the coal thieves, the bold, the hungry, the frost-bitten entrepreneurs of the night. Some snuck into coal yards under the fog, filling sacks and fleeing before dawn. Others dug into barges along the river, scraping whatever they could reach. One 1850 police report described a boy caught with coal hidden in his hat, trousers, and even down his boots. When asked why, he replied, "Sir, it's warmer that way." The magistrate was not amused, but the audience in court reportedly laughed. If you did manage to get coal, the next battle was making it last. Families burned it in tiny grates or stoves that looked like iron coffins. The trick was to light it with as little wood as possible, since wood too cost money. People used scraps of paper, rags, or even bits of old furniture as kindling. You'd feed the fire like a nervous parent, terrified it might go out and take your will to live with it. The heat never filled the room, it just hovered near the hearth, while the corners froze like neglected relatives. In some homes, coal wasn't burned all at once. It was rationed, a few lumps in the morning, a few more at night, each one handled like treasure. Housewives became experts at banking fires, burying the embers under ash so they'd survive till morning. It was less domestic comfort and more emergency management. The air quality in those cramped rooms was its own horror story. A poorly vented fire turned the house into a smokehouse, and many Londoners spent their winters in a semi-permanent fog of coal dust and wheezing. But to them, smoke meant warmth, and warmth meant life. The real danger was silence. When the crackling stopped, that meant the cold had won. Charitable societies and reformers occasionally organised coal drives, collections to provide fuel for the destitute. They'd write pious pamphlets about the warmth of Christian giving, neglecting to mention that a week's worth of charity coal could vanish in a single night. Still, those brief bursts of generosity saved lives. A few lumps could keep a child breathing till spring. In some parts of the city, entire black markets emerged around coal dust. Merchants would sweep up the powder from yards and sell it pressed into cheap bricks, breeze blocks, they called them, that smoked terribly and heated little. Families bought them anyway. A fire that choked you half to death was still better than no fire at all. Coal was like love. Everyone wanted it, few could afford it, and sometimes you got burned. It dirtied your hands, blackened your walls, and poisoned your lungs, but it was the only thing standing between you and a frozen grave. In the East End, romance wasn't candlelight dinners. It was two people huddled by the grate, watching a single coal glow like the last heartbeat of the house. The good news, you found fuel. The bad news, you had to choose between burning it or breathing it. When coal was too dear, and it usually was, London's poor turned to desperation disguised as innovation. The Victorian fireplace wasn't a symbol of warmth, it was a test of imagination. Because when you couldn't afford fuel, you burned whatever the city had already given up on. There were homes where the hearth stayed dark all winter. The grate sat empty, like a mouth waiting to be fed. People would cluster around it anyway, because habit is warmer than air. The faintest ember became an event. If someone managed to get a spark going, even a brief flicker, neighbours might drop by just to bask in the idea of heat. In the slums, you didn't gather around the fire, you gathered around the memory of one. Those who couldn't afford coal still refused to freeze quietly. They invented their own heating systems, powered by rubbish, desperation, and courage. Old shoes, broken chairs, shredded rope, rags soaked in fat, anything that burned, and quite a few things that shouldn't, went into the hearth. Newspapers became kindling, floorboards became sacrifices, and trash became treasure. If your fire didn't smoke you out, one Londoner joked, it probably just gave up. The problem was that most of these makeshift fires didn't heat the home, they fumigated it. London's air was already an experiment in slow suffocation. Adding burning leather, oily rags and mouldy wood made it worse. Rooms filled with a choking fog that turned eyes red and lungs black. The poor coughed through dinners of smoke instead of soup, but still the fires burned because the alternative was frostbite and death. Some found creative ways to keep their small fires alive. Old tins were turned into fireboxes, crude stoves with holes punched in the sides. They'd burn scraps slowly, feeding in bits of trash through the night. Families rotated around them like planets, each taking turns to warm their hands. Children sat close enough to melt the soles of their boots. If they were lucky, the warmth might spread a few inches beyond the grate, far enough to thaw the teapot or stop the ink from freezing. The resourceful or reckless that even ventured outside in search of burnable miracles. The city dumps, called dust heaps, became treasure troves for those willing to dig through filth. People scavenged for cinders, half-burned lumps, or bits of wood still dry enough to catch flame. It was a dirty business, but it beat freezing. There were tales of entire families making nightly pilgrimages to the dumps, armed with sacks and hope, returning home blackened with soot but triumphant. In the poorest corners, even rubbish ran out. That's when the truly grim improvisations began. Some tore up floorboards to feed the fire, sacrificing the house to save the body. Others burned furniture, then wooden doors, and finally anything that could be pried loose. There were cases of people burning their own bed frames. It was tragic, yes, but also deeply Victorian. Pragmatic suffering with excellent commitment to theme. Those who couldn't find fuel at all tried to fake it. They'd sit by a cold grate, holding their hands out to nothing, pretending warmth into existence. Psychologists might call it denial. Londoners called it Tuesday. Some boiled water to release steam just to give the illusion of heat in the air. The poor didn't live in comfort, they lived in stubborn defiance. Of course, improvised fires came with another problem. They killed people. Poisonous fumes filled the air as people burned treated wood, paint and garbage. Ventilation was rare. After all, you couldn't open a window without inviting the entire East-winter dinner. Carbon monoxide poisoning was a silent winter guest in many homes. Families went to bed huddled together for warmth and sometimes didn't wake up. The morning neighbours would find them still curled beside a blackened hearth, smoke marks above their heads like halos. And yet London carried on. In the East End, you learned not to look too long into anyone's fire. It might be the only thing they had left. The city's reformers loved to write about the moral lessons of thrift and hard work, never noticing that thrift had turned into combustion. To burn your own furniture wasn't waste, it was perseverance with splinters. Outside, the richer districts crackled with cheerful fires, glowing in windows like taunts. Smoke rose in neat plumes from Mayfair and Kensington, while the East End coughed up a mixture of fog and regret. The poor could always tell the difference between coal smoke and rubbish fires. Coal smoke was steady and grey, rubbish smoke was angry, oily and desperate. But somehow life went on. In between the hacking coughs and the sputtering flames there were jokes, shared warmth, and grim laughter. Because even in the choking dark, humour burned cleaner than anything else. The good news, you found something to burn. The bad news, it was probably part of your house. When your home offered the same temperature as the grave, the streets of Victorian London became your best and only source of heat. In a city powered by fire, from bakeries to forges to gas lamps, warmth leaked out in small, tantalising doses. The poor learned to hunt it like a rare animal. They became thermal opportunists, experts in identifying exactly where London's heat escaped and how to stand close enough to feel it without getting arrested or kicked. The bakery, for instance, wasn't just for bread. It was London's first central heating system. Every street with a bakehouse became an unofficial refuge. Before dawn, when the ovens fired up, the air outside filled with a glorious yeasty warmth that drew the cold and hungry like moths. You could spot the regulars by the way they stood, palms open to the air vents, faces tilted just enough to catch the heat without getting ash in their eyes. The bakers didn't love it. Human ornaments, they called them, but they tolerated it, if only because pity cost nothing and sometimes meant free labour. If you helped haul flour or sweep, you might get a crust of bread and 5 minutes of borrowed warmth. Factories were another favourite, though less romantic. Ironworks, breweries and gas plants belched out heat in filthy abundance. Workers inside roasted while the poor outside queued to catch the leftovers. Standing near the factory walls meant risking burns, but in February burns were basically luxury scars. Children clustered by the metal grates and steam pipes that hissed along the outer walls, inhaling the fumes like they were perfume. The warmth reeked of smoke and grease, but to freezing lungs, it was ambrosia. Then there were the sewers. Yes, the sewers. London's underbelly steamed with a grim kind of life, especially where waste met hot water runoff from industry. Open drains along the streets sometimes released little puffs of warmth into the fog. The smell was catastrophic, but so was hypothermia. You'd find people crouched near these vents, faces half hidden by scarves, trying to convince themselves that warm and disgusting was better than cold and dead. The city itself breathed beneath their feet, a warm monster exhaling filth and salvation in the same breath. The resourceful poor also discovered the miracle of gas lamps. These new marvels of technology cast not only light, but also a surprising amount of heat. At night, beggars, street sweepers and matchgirls crowded around them like worshippers at a glowing altar. The gas company would have been horrified to see how many people tried to borrow its warmth, or worse, its flame. Every now and then, someone too eager to warm their hands caught a sleeve on fire, creating a brief, tragic moment of extra brightness. But still they gathered, huddling together, trading stories and jokes in the flickering yellow glow. Another trick of survival was what locals called body weather. If you couldn't find fire, you found people. The human crowd became its own furnace, street markets, taverns and alleys filled with tightly packed bodies radiating shared heat. It was a simple physics equation. Misery plus proximity equaled comfort. Mothers wrapped their infants under coats and shawls, relying on body heat to keep them alive. Couples sat pressed against one another not out of romance, but thermodynamics. Horses were part of the system too. Cab stands became unofficial warming stations. When the carriages stopped, steam rose from the animals' flanks, and people, especially children, would edge close enough to feel it. Drivers shooed them away, but not too harshly. The horses themselves didn't seem to mind. They were probably warmer than half the city. Standing beside a horse's belly might have been humiliating, but it beat freezing in an alley. Some establishments, taverns, bakeries, public houses, allowed the desperate to stand near their doorways just long enough to thaw. For the price of a halfpenny ale, you could linger by the fire until your fingers remembered how to bend. The heat was intoxicating. People described it as a drink you can breathe. But linger too long without paying, and the barkeep's patience evaporated faster than your chill. In wealthier parts of London, the poor even borrowed warmth from the rich, literally. They'd walk the pavements outside mansion houses, where the servants' grates and kitchen vents blew out blessed hot air. The trick was to look like you belonged there just long enough to enjoy it. Too long, and you'd get the boot from a butler with opinions about class and carbon monoxide. The phenomenon of street heat became so widespread that newspapers mocked it. Columns joked about the London lizard, describing the poor basking wherever the city leaked warmth. They called it sloth, but it was strategy. After all, the city wasted enough energy to light up half the world. The least it could do was share a little of it with those dying on its steps. Of course, these stolen embers were fleeting. The warmth lasted minutes, the cold lasted months, but in a life measured by small mercies, those minutes mattered. A single warm brick held under your coat could make the walk home survivable. A vent's breath could restore feeling to your fingers. A bakery's glow could make you forget, briefly, that the rest of the city was colder than charity itself. The good news? The city was full of heat. The bad news? None of it belonged to you. When the Thames froze, London didn't just get cold, it got theatrical. The city transformed into an unplanned ice sculpture, a frozen labyrinth where survival came with style and broken bones. The winter of 1855 was so brutal that even the rats were seen wearing thicker fur. Streets hardened like glass, pipes burst like overripe fruit, and the Thames, that murky, ancient artery, sewed, stiffened, and finally stopped. For the poor, this wasn't a postcard winter. It was chaos with icicles. The Thames freezing was less a curiosity and more a civic disaster. Barges were trapped mid-river, ferrymen out of work, and water sellers suddenly unemployed. Though to be fair, there was no shortage of ice. Bridges turned slick, docks glittered dangerously, and every errand became a slapstick performance. The rich, naturally, called it picturesque. Painters rushed to capture the noble stillness of the river, while in the East End people were busy sliding across it in search of firewood or a quicker commute. Ice thick enough to stand on didn't mean safe. It just meant the city hadn't decided who'd fall through yet. Every winter, someone tested fate and physics with a heroic shout of "It'll hold," followed by the unforgettable sound of regret meeting water. The streets weren't any kinder. When the fog froze to cobblestones, every Londoner became a reluctant acrobat. Boots slipped, baskets flew, and whole markets toppled in a choreography of curses. Horses were the true victims, skidding, collapsing, and occasionally dragging carriages sideways into shop fronts. It was like watching ballet if ballet involved screaming and proportion damage. And once a horse went down, it took a village to lift it back up, assuming it wasn't too late. Icicles formed on gutters like daggers, and falling ones could and did impale the unluckier pedestrians. Newspapers even ran small death notices for frozen projectiles from the heavens. In London, you didn't just risk dying of hunger or disease, you could die because the roof decided to sneeze. Street vendors carried on because poverty doesn't close for weather. They sold roasted chestnuts beside freezing drains, hands wrapped in rags. Mingling with frost, their cries, "Hot pies! Eels! Coffee!" sounded more desperate than musical when their lips barely moved. The frost silenced everything else, footsteps, laughter, even the river's constant mumble. It was as if London itself had stopped breathing. Then came the carts, London's daily gamble. Wheels turned treacherous on the ice, iron rims spinning without traction. Drivers cursed, horses panicked, and bystanders learned the art of dodging runaways. Entire loads of coal, vegetables, and sometimes unfortunate passengers skidded into walls. Street accidents became so frequent that police officers were assigned just to supervise intersections, though they mostly watched helplessly, their moustaches frozen solid. The Thames, meanwhile, drew its own peculiar crowds. Once thick enough, people ventured onto it like moths drawn to stupidity. Stalls sprang up overnight, sellers hawking gingerbread, roasted nuts, and mulled gin. The ice fairs of centuries past were nearly gone by the Victorian era, but echoes remained, laughter, music, and the occasional scream when the ice cracked beneath a too bold dancer. The frost turned the river into a temporary carnival, a place where joy and danger collided. But beneath the laughter was risk. The ice was treacherous, uneven and constantly shifting. Whole chunks drifted loose, carrying off whatever or whoever stood on them. Rescue was nearly impossible. The cold water killed faster than the current. The newspapers called them melancholy accidents, a polite phrase for frozen funerals. For those who couldn't risk the river, the streets were trial enough. Frost turned the gutters into glassy trenches, and the slush that followed was worse. A vile grey soup of mud, soot and horse droppings that froze overnight and thawed into chaos by noon. Boots soaked through within minutes, and anyone unlucky enough to fall risked frostbite from their own clothing. The city's famous fog mixed with the frost until visibility dropped to arm's length, a cosy arrangement until a wagon nearly ran you over. Street sweepers tried to spread ashes and grit to prevent slips, but there weren't enough hands or ashes to go around. The city was vast, the poor countless, and the cold relentless. Even the cries of "Mind the ice" echoed hollowly, lost in the muffled quiet of a city gone rigid. In the midst of it all, humour persisted, dark, brittle, but alive. Londoners joked that the cold had finally united the classes. Everyone was falling over. "In Victorian London," one wag quipped, "even gravity joined the working class. Everyone hit the ground." The laughter echoed down the frozen alleys, proof that if the city couldn't stay warm, at least it could stay sarcastic. And so the poor trudged on, across the ice, through the sludge, beneath the dripping death traps of icicles, with the same resigned endurance that had carried them through everything else. The river froze, the streets glittered, and London looked almost beautiful if you didn't have to live in it. The good news? The city sparkled like crystal. The bad news? So did the morgue. When night fell over the slums of Victorian London, it didn't fall softly. It dropped like a curtain, heavy and absolute. The sun vanished early in winter, swallowed by fog and smoke, leaving the city to the mercy of gas lamps and bad intentions. For the rich, evening meant fireside comfort and parlour games. For the poor, it meant danger, darkness, and a long stretch of hours that needed surviving. In the East End, night was its own kind of weather, sharp, damp, and full of whispering things. Frost crept along windows like spiderwebs, and the air turned brittle. The cobblestones gleamed with ice, and every sound, a cough, a footstep, a whisper, seemed louder in the cold now. The slums didn't sleep, they endured. Somewhere someone cried out, somewhere else, someone pretended not to hear. Inside, people did what they could to fight the night. Candles burned low, their flames quivering in draughts like nervous witnesses. Gaslight was rare. Most couldn't afford the luxury. Instead, one candle might serve an entire room, shared among half a dozen tenants, each taking turns to stitch, write, or simply watch the flame as though it could keep the cold away. But once the candle died, so did the illusion of safety. Outside, the streets transformed. Shopkeepers shuttered their windows, pubs pulled in their signs, and the narrow alleys filled with the sounds of boots and whispers. The police, those famous London peelers, trolled with lanterns that barely pierced the fog. Their rounds were few and far between. In the spaces between their footsteps, the city reverted to its natural state. Cold, silent and predatory. Crime loved the cold. Darkness was its accomplice and hunger its excuse. Pickpockets, cut purses and thieves prowled the lanes, not for riches, those were safely locked behind Mayfair doors, but for anything that could be sold, traded or eaten. The line between criminal and survivor blurred when frostbite nipped at your fingers. Some stole food, some coal, some simply a moment near someone else's fire. At night, they said, the only thing moving faster than the wind was your will to survive. And then there was the frostbite, the quiet killer. It struck hardest after midnight, when bodies slowed and blankets thinned. Toes went first, then fingers, then hope. The newspapers occasionally reported unfortunates found frozen in the morning, as if the victims had politely chosen not to inconvenience anyone by dying indoors. Children huddled together under stairwells, couples under bridges, beggars beneath market awnings, all trying to outlast the dark. Some succeeded, some simply looked asleep. Street lighting existed technically, but in the slums it was as unreliable as charity. Gas lamps flickered faintly along main roads, leaving entire alleys black. The fog swallowed light whole, turning lanterns into dull halos. The glow only served to emphasize the darkness around it, as if mocking the idea that a flame could tame this city. You could walk 10 paces from a lamp and vanish completely. It wasn't unusual for the police to find bodies half a street away, frozen or robbed or both. Curfews weren't official, but they were understood. The poor learned to be indoors before the dark thickened. Not that indoors guaranteed safety. Thefts and assaults happened behind thin doors just as easily. Still, most people stayed put after dusk. The bravest, or the most desperate, ventured out, their footsteps muffled by frost. Night hawkers called out until their voices cracked, selling roasted chestnuts or stale pies. Street musicians played until their fingers stiffened, bowing to an audience of shadows. In the tenements, night brought a strange chorus, the crack of timber contracting in the cold, the drip of melting frost, the groans of sleepers shifting in their shared beds. Conversations hushed, prayers began. Parents murmured to children stories of better days, a polite lie to soften the hunger. Every sound outside, a knock, a cry, a window slam, made hearts jump. The dark wasn't empty, it was listening. And yet, in all that misery, there was a kind of fragile beauty. The snow, when it fell, muffled the filth and noise, wrapping even the ugliest alleys in pale quiet. For a moment, London seemed gentle. Footprints crunched softly, the lamps glowed amber, and the cold air sparkled like glass. Even the poor paused to look up, their breath rising like smoke in the lamplight. It didn't make the night warmer, but it made it bearable. Of course, beauty didn't last. By dawn, the snow would be grey again, trampled into sludge. The frost would loosen its grip just enough to release the dead. The city would wake to another day of smoke, hunger and work. Nightfall would return again right on schedule. Because in Victorian London, the dark wasn't an ending. It was an interval, a pause between struggles, where the cold ruled the streets and the brave learned to steal warmth from the stars. The good news? Morning always came. The bad news? So did everything else. When hunger and cold joined forces in Victorian London, the soup kitchen became the last thin barrier between survival and surrender. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't hearty. It was called soup, but legally it was more of a rumour, a watery optimism seasoned with disappointment. Still, for thousands of London's poor, that steaming ladle of hope kept them alive through winters that seemed determined to kill them. By the mid-19th century, London's charities, churches and moral reform societies had learned one thing. Starving people made for bad Christians and worse workers. So soup kitchens sprang up in church basements, alley missions and converted warehouses, places where faith met famine over a boiling pot. The lines began early. Long before dawn, shapes gathered in the fog, shuffling toward the promise of warmth and food. From a distance, they looked like ghosts queuing for reincarnation. Inside, the air was thick, not with aroma, but with steam, smoke, and human breath. Volunteers in aprons ladled the liquid into tin bowls, each portion carefully measured to stretch the supply. The broth was usually made from meat bones boiled within an inch of their lives, with maybe a turnip, some barley, and the occasional surprise pea. Nutritionists today would classify it somewhere between beverage and warm disappointment. Still, it was hot, and into winter, hot was a luxury that could make you weep. The poor didn't complain, at least not loudly. Complaining risked being told to move along, and you didn't argue with charity in a city that believed poverty was a personal hobby. The mission sermons often came first, a few hymns, a lecture on temperance, a reminder that God helped those who didn't drink gin before breakfast. Only then came the soup. Souls first, stomachs second was the unspoken policy, but when you hadn't eaten in 2 days, theology went down easier with a spoonful of broth. Soup kitchens were equal parts mercy and morality theatre. Donors loved to imagine they were feeding the grateful poor. The poor knew they were performing gratitude to keep the bowls coming. A polite "God bless you" could earn a slightly fuller ladle. The regulars learnt the routine. Stand straight, look penitent. Don't cough too much in the bowl. The more virtuous you looked, the better your odds of seconds. For the operators, the work was both exhausting and theatrical. The kitchen clanged with the noise of tin pots, boiling vats, and shouted orders. Steam curled up in ghostly clouds, fogging the windows until even the outside world disappeared. The smell of boiled bones clung to clothing like a badge of devotion. And through it all, a steady stream of the city's forgotten poured in. Factory widows, dock labourers, chimney sweeps, children whose shoes were ambition only. Outside, the line never ended. People wrapped in shawls or newspaper stood stamping their feet to keep the blood moving. Fights broke out when the queue grew too long or the soup too thin. The police occasionally waded in, not out of compassion, but because unpaid hunger had a habit of turning into unpaid crime. Still, the line always reformed. Hope, even watered down, was addictive. The most successful soup kitchens became local legends. Some, like the Ragged School Missions, expanded into full-blown relief centres offering bread, tea, or even a second-hand coat. Others operated out of makeshift sheds, serving hundreds a day with little more than goodwill and a single pot large enough to drown your sorrows in. The Salvation Army would later perfect the formula. Music, sermons, and soup, the holy trinity of Victorian charity. But not every bowl of kindness was safe. Poorly cooked meat or contaminated water turned Christian charity into cholera in a cup. Epidemics often followed the same routes as compassion. Inspectors complained of kitchens that reused broth for days until it achieved a consistency of moral concern and microbial danger. Still, people came. You could survive a bad soup, you couldn't survive no soup, and for children, soup day was an event. They brought whatever container they could find, mugs, tins, broken teapots, and guarded their portion like treasure. The steam fogged their faces, giving them an almost holy glow. Adults sometimes pretended not to notice when a child got served first. After all, everyone knew that tomorrow's hunger had smaller hands today. And yet, despite the bleakness, the soup kitchen carried a strange dignity. It was a place where no one pretended the city cared, but at least for a few minutes the cold stopped winning. The poor came to eat, but also to belong, to stand in a crowd that understood, to trade a joke, to share a spoon. For a handful of minutes hunger had company. As the bowls emptied and the lines dispersed, the cold crept back in. People wrapped their scarves tighter and shuffled into the dark, bellies faintly warmed, spirits slightly less so. Behind them, the volunteers scrubbed the pots and prepared to do it all again tomorrow. There was never enough soup, never enough spoons, and never enough hope, but somehow it kept flowing. The good news, dinner was hot. The bad news, so was the sermon. When the temperature plummeted and the streets became a frozen lottery of who'd wake up breathing, the penny lodging house was the next best thing to not dying. These establishments dotted the East End like grim hotels for the desperate, their only amenities being a roof, a wall, and the faint promise that you'd leave in roughly the same number of pieces you arrived with. A single penny was your ticket inside. 1 coin to rent a square foot of floor, a rope to lean on, or if you were truly blessed, a mattress that could politely be described as historically significant. It wasn't luxury. It was triage. Every night, the same crowd shuffled in. Dock labourers, street hawkers, widows, children without parents, parents without hope, all drawn by the same beacon, the warm stink of humanity packed too tightly to freeze. Inside, the air hit you like a physical force, a mixture of damp wool, sweat, cheap gin, and human despair that clung to the walls like fog. The heat was overwhelming, not because the room was warm, but maybe because there were too many people generating their own. If you couldn't afford a blanket, don't worry. Someone else's body heat had you covered. Literally. Sleeping in a penny lodging meant embracing the intimate, unromantic reality of shared survival. Beds were optional. Some houses offered penny sits, benches where you could doze upright until dawn. The cheaper kind provided ropes strung across the room at chest height. For half a penny you could lean forward and nap while hanging from it, like laundry with dreams. When morning came, the keeper cut the rope, and everyone fell forward in unison, the Victorian equivalent of an alarm clock. If you could pay the full penny, you got a bed. Though bed was generous. These were straw pallets, infested with fleas industrious enough to unionize. Sheets were rare, pillows rarer, and personal space non-existent. You slept shoulder to shoulder with strangers, the symphony of snores, coughs, and muttered nightmares providing the soundtrack. Privacy was measured in inches and lasted as long as consciousness. The lodging house keepers were a mixed breed, some kindly, some cruel, all exhausted. They ran their dens like clockwork, open at dusk, emptied at dawn, disinfected never. Inspectors occasionally tried to enforce cleanliness standards, but those usually lasted until the inspector left. The poor didn't have the luxury of complaining. They were too busy trying to breathe. The walls dripped condensation, and the air felt alive, mostly because it was. Still, the penny lodging had its own strange society. The regulars knew each other, by name or by cough. There were unspoken rules. Don't steal, don't fight too loudly, and don't die on the bed someone else paid for. Conversation flickered like candlelight, short, necessary, and often darkly funny. You might hear about a new factory job, a runaway wife, or the latest blessing from the charity soup line. The talk was rough but real. Everyone understood what it meant to live 1 penny away from the street. The lucky lodgers snagged spots near the stove, a small iron beast that barely radiated heat beyond its shadow. Everyone else relied on proximity. Press close, share warmth, ignore the smell. It wasn't comfort, but it was company. For many, the warmth of strangers was the closest thing to family left. Rats, of course, were permanent tenants. They scurried under the floorboards and occasionally over the beds. If one brushed your face during the night, you didn't scream, you negotiated. Just passing through, or are we? The vermin were like the wallpaper, unpleasant, unavoidable, and definitely not refundable. In the worst cold, lodging houses overflowed. Those who arrived too late were turned away into the frost. Some slept in stables, some under bridges, some in doorways warmed by other people's fires. The penny houses became the thin line between discomfort and death, and the city knew it. Reformers and journalists occasionally toured them, armed with notebooks and outrage. Their reports shocked the middle class for about 5 minutes, just long enough to finish breakfast. Then London carried on, grateful that misery was conveniently contained in buildings you could avoid looking at. For all their horror, the penny lodgings offered something priceless. Time. 1 night of rest meant 1 more morning to try again. To find work, to beg a crust, to exist. They were the city's waiting rooms between despair and tomorrow. No one dreamed of staying there forever, only of surviving long enough to leave. As dawn crept through cracked windows, the keeper's voice would bark, "Up! Up and out!" The lodgers stirred, groaning, dressing in clothes that never truly dried. The ropes were cut, the benches cleared, the beds shaken out like dusty memories. People filed into the freezing morning, steaming like ghosts, carrying their fatigue with them into another day. The good news? You got through the night. The bad news? You'd probably see the same faces tomorrow, assuming they woke up too. If the penny lodging was survival with company, the workhouse was survival with paperwork. The Victorians, ever devoted to moral efficiency, invented a system that managed to combine charity, bureaucracy, and psychological warfare, and then called it compassion. The workhouse was the government's cold-hearted solution to poverty. Feed the poor just enough to keep them alive, humiliate them so they wouldn't then enjoy it, and call it progress. To the reformers of the 1834 Poor Law, poverty wasn't a misfortune, it was a moral condition. The new rules declared that aid should only be available under deterrent conditions, meaning the workhouse had to be worse than the street, and somehow they nailed it. If hell had a waiting room, it would have looked suspiciously like a Victorian workhouse in midwinter. Every winter, the gates filled with desperate figures. The old, the sick, widows with the children, men broken by unemployment. They arrived shivering, clutching bundles of clothes that smelled of smoke and survival. At the door, the first thing they received wasn't comfort, but question. Name, age, birthplace, religion, everything catalogued, as if the frostbite might be contagious. Then came the indignity. You were stripped, searched, washed, and issued a uniform that screamed, "Congratulations, you're a property of the parish now." Families were separated instantly, men to one wing, women to another, children somewhere else entirely. Affection was considered unsanitary. Husbands and wives who had shared 40 years of life together were now forbidden even to speak without permission. The workhouse claimed to cure poverty by curing love. The policy was clear. If you want warmth, don't expect kindness with it. Inside, warmth was theoretical. Fires were lit sparingly, just enough to keep the walls from cracking. Beds were hard, blankets thin, and the air smelled like boiled linen and resignation. Workhouse officials were obsessed with efficiency, which meant heating was only for those parts of the building currently producing something profitable. You could freeze in a corner, but heaven forbid the laundry cool down. Meals were another lesson in discipline. The workhouse offered 3 things: shelter, shame, and scalding gruel. Breakfast was a watery porridge. Lunch, a few ounces of bread and cheese. Dinner, whatever vegetables had lost the will to live. Meat appeared occasionally, but only in forms unrecognisable to modern science. Seconds didn't exist. Complaining was considered a luxury item. You should be grateful, the masters would say, for your daily bread. And the poor were, mostly because bread was sometimes the only part that wasn't boiling hot or questionably grey. Labour filled the days. Men broke stones, picked oakum, old rope soaked in tar, or scrubbed endless floors. Women mended uniforms, washed linens, or sewed until their fingers bled. Even the elderly were given light duties, which was bureaucratic slang for slow suffering. The theory was that work built character. The reality was that it destroyed bodies faster than the cold. The workhouse had rules for everything: silence during meals, obedience at all times, prayer on command, and laughter was treated like contraband. One inspector wrote approvingly that the establishment runs with military precision, which was true if you imagined an army where everyone was half-starved and permanently demoralised. And yet, for all its cruelty, the workhouse was packed each winter. Because outside its walls, people froze. Inside, at least you could count on a roof and a kind of predictable misery. The choice was grim arithmetic, humiliation in warmth or dignity in the snow. Some chose the former. Others, proud or terrified of losing their families, chose to starve on their own terms. The workhouse was charity by coercion. You could enter, but you left as a cautionary tale. Inspectors and politicians occasionally toured the facilities, congratulating themselves on their humane governance. They'd find everything orderly and clean, because the inmates had been up all night scrubbing in preparation. Reformers loved to write pamphlets about the grateful poor, as if gratitude were a measurable output like soap or thread. What they never mentioned was the quiet despair, the faces that stared at their soup bowls like mirrors, the silence that followed every prayer. Children born in workhouses knew no other world. They grew up on rations of gruel, discipline, and sins. When they laughed, it startled the staff. Some escaped, many didn't. For them, winter wasn't a season, it was the default setting of life. Outside the walls, London's citizens often debated whether the system was too lenient. The poor are too comfortable, grumbled those with fires of their own. They imagined workhouse inmates lounging in heated dormitories, sipping broth and plotting idleness. Reality was somewhat less cosy. Frost creeping under doors, hands cracked from cold water, and the occasional inmate found stiff in bed by morning. The workhouse was the state's way of saying, "We care, just not too much." It was efficient, moral, and pitiless. And for all its rules and registers, it couldn't stop the same people from coming back every winter. Because poverty isn't something you cure with paperwork and porridge. The good news, you got a roof over your head. The bad news, it came with a sermon, a uniform, and a side of despair. When the cold hit the lungs of London's poor, medicine wasn't found in bottles. It was improvised in cups, jars, and sheer desperation. Doctors existed, of course, but they charged fees that could buy a week's worth of food. Apothecaries stocked tonics with names that sounded promising. Dr. Collis Brown's Chlorodyne or Godfrey's Cordial. But the price tags could make a man cough harder. So the poor brewed their own cures from whatever was cheapest, strongest, or least poisonous that week. The average East Ender didn't have a medicine cabinet. They had a kitchen shelf with two constants, gin and goose grease. Gin, because it numbed everything from toothache to heartbreak, and goose grease, because if it didn't fix you, at least you were nicely basted. Mothers swore by it. Rubbed on the chest, it drew out the chill. Rubbed on the throat, it soothed the windpipe. Rubbed anywhere else, it mostly made you slippery. Herbal remedies were popular too, though the herbs were often more philosophical than botanical. Pennyroyal, mustard, onion poultices, vinegar-soaked cloths, all pressed to the skin until the patient screamed, better. Pain in Victorian folk medicine was proof of effectiveness. If it burned, it healed. If it didn't, drink more gin until it did. Coughs were the winter soundtrack of the slums, echoing through tenements like unpaid rent. Real medicine, laudanum for instance, was both precious and deadly. It stopped coughing by stopping just about everything else. Mothers gave it to babies to help them sleep through the cold, and many did, for longer than intended. Patent medicines were unregulated miracles in bottles, promising to cure consumption, fevers, headaches, and possibly your personality. They were mostly alcohol, opium, or chloroform, sometimes all three. Guaranteed to calm the nerves, the label said. It did, mainly by removing consciousness. For less chemical solutions, there were steams and smokes, a basin of boiling water, a towel over the head, and hope. If you were lucky, you had eucalyptus or peppermint to toss in. If not, a spoonful of mustard did the trick, or at least convinced your eyes to focus on something other than your misery. Some even inhaled the fumes from burning tar or vinegar-soaked rags, claiming it cleared the lungs. It did, permanently in some cases. Street healers and quacks thrived in this environment, shouting promises louder than church bells. Cures for chills, for coughs, for corns, for life itself. They sold powders that tasted like dirt and potions that glowed suspiciously in the dark. A man might spend his last penny on a bottle of elixir of health that turned out to be rum flavoured with molasses. Still, at least it warmed you. And that was half the point. The slums even had their own medical folklore. Cold feet, tie onions to them overnight. Chest pains, press a hot potato to your ribs. Sore throat. Gargle with salt and vinegar until you could no longer complain about it. Fever, wrap the patient in wet sheets to draw out the heat, then pray they didn't freeze before the fever left. These remedies weren't scientific, but neither was dying for free. When illness turned serious, pneumonia, consumption, rheumatic fever, home cures gave way to faith. Not necessarily in God, but in endurance. Hospitals were a last resort, viewed with the same dread as debtors' prisons. The wards were cold, crowded, and contagious. You went in with a cough and came out with a tag. Many preferred to die at home, surrounded by familiar mould. For children, the remedies were particularly inventive. Mothers wrapped flannel around tiny chests, spooned treacle mixed with vinegar, and blew smoke from a candle into the air to kill the bad spirits. If the child survived, the treatment was praised. If not, it was chalked up to the Lord's will, which was Victorian for, we don't know what we're doing. And yet, amid the superstition, there was genius born of necessity. The poor invented their own pharmacies from the scraps of London. A bit of soot for poultices, a handful of herbs from the market, bacon fat for burns, soap for bites, bread crusts soaked in milk for ulcers, though getting milk in winter required divine intervention. You used what you had because what you didn't have was a doctor. There were small miracles too. Local women who became known as healers, the granny doctors, dispensing advice, herbs, and scoldings in equal measure. They charged pennies, listened patiently, and occasionally saved lives. Science might sneer, but in a city where official medicine had no time for the poor, these women were the front line of compassion and gossip. In truth, the medicine cabinet of the poor wasn't filled with cures, it was filled with coping mechanisms. Gin dulled the pain, laughter distracted from it, and faith, however shaky, filled the rest. For all its filth and frost, the slum managed to stay alive through a mixture of invention, superstition, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to quit. The good news? You had treatments for every ailment. The bad news? Most of them involved onions, alcohol, or prayer, sometimes all at once. In Victorian London, winter didn't just freeze fingers, it froze appetites in place. Food like warmth became a luxury item. The rich dined on roast beef and puddings that steamed with arrogance, while the poor scavenged for anything edible that didn't try to run away first. Finding food in the slums wasn't just survival, it was sport, science, and occasionally divine comedy. Markets like Billingsgate, Smithfield, and Spitalfields were the city's beating stomach. During the warmer months, they overflowed with produce and meat, but in winter the options dwindled to whatever hadn't spoiled or escaped. Fishmongers hacked at frozen slabs of cod with tools better suited for carpentry. Butchers sold joints so small you needed a magnifying glass to see them. And fruit? If you saw an orange, it was probably in a painting. Street food became the true diet of the working poor, the original fast food, minus the hygiene or speed. You could buy roasted chestnuts, whelks, baked potatoes, hot pies of questionable content, and slices of pudding dense enough to serve as weapons. Everything was cooked outdoors, on small stoves and carts, wrapped in paper greasy enough to count as a side dish. It wasn't about taste, it was about temperature. The food wasn't meant to fill you, it was meant to remind you what heat felt like. Vendors shouted through the fog like heralds of mediocrity. Eels, hot eels, halfpenny a bowl. The eel trade thrived because eels were both abundant and cheap. 2 words never used about cows. Jelly eels, eel pies, fried eels. Londoners ate them until they could dream in slither. If you couldn't afford the real thing, some sellers offered eel water, which was exactly what it sounded like. The leftover boil from someone else's meal. Potatoes were the other winter hero, baked black on the outside, molten within. For a penny, you could hold one in your hands and pretend your life had meaning. If you couldn't eat it right away, you used it as a hand warmer, and then, when it cooled, a snack. The humble spud fed an empire of exhaustion. Then there were the pies, mysterious, steaming, and slightly suspicious. A proper meat pie could cost too much, but the cheaper ones sold in the East End were filled with whatever the butcher couldn't identify under oath. Some joked that the city's missing cats had gone into business for themselves. Bakers denied it, of course, but they also worked suspiciously close to the tanneries. Still, a hot pie was hot, and in Victorian London, that alone counted as seasoning. For the truly broke, dinner came from the gutters, not metaphorically, but literally. Bakers threw out burned loaves, grocers discarded wilted vegetables, and butchers swept scraps into buckets. Children and scavengers waited for those moments, swooping in to grab what the city's appetite had rejected. You didn't choose your meal, you intercepted it. Waste not, want not, said the Victorians, safely from their dining rooms. And then there was bone soup, the slum classic. You'd beg a butcher for bones with just enough marrow left to make broth, boil them for hours, and share the result among the household. The broth was thin, but the pride was thick. Add in an onion or a carrot if fortune smiled, and you could call it stew. It didn't taste like much, but it was warm, and warmth was the only spice the poor could afford. Leftovers, when they existed, were reincarnated endlessly. Yesterday's soup became today's porridge, became tomorrow's mystery dish. Bread, if it hardened, was soaked in water and sugar to create bread pudding, which was optimistic branding for survival mush. Even tea leaves were reused multiple times, steeped until the water was more memory than beverage. Children learned early how to forage. They picked up crumbs from bakeries, chased fruit carts for the occasional fallen apple, or begged outside pubs for the dregs of beer-soaked bread. Mothers grew inventive. Porridge stretched with water, flour thickened with soot-coloured treacle, anything to make a meal last one more day. Dinner didn't warm your soul, it politely reminded you still had one. Charity kitchens sometimes handed out bread or stew, but only after sermons that lasted longer than the meal. The lines were long, the bowls small, and the gratitude mandatory. Still, even bad stew beat an empty stomach. Some reformers suggested feeding the poor on nutrient biscuits, an early form of industrialised misery made from compressed flour, fat and guilt. They were nutritious, in the same way wallpaper paste is structural. Despite all odds, there were moments of joy around food. Neighbours shared scraps when they could, street cooks told jokes as they stirred their dubious pots, and children still smiled at the sight of something steaming. The poor might not have had enough to eat, but they had enough spirit to mock the hunger. "We feast like kings," one man laughed over a bowl of potato peelings. "If the king's been robbed blind." Winter in London was cruel to the stomach, but it revealed the city's stubborn heart. Every loaf stretched, every soup reheated, every crust divided, small acts of rebellion against a world that treated hunger as a moral failing. The good news, dinner was served. The bad news, you'd have to guess what it used to be. In the frozen misery of Victorian winter, one species prospered. It didn't pay rent, it didn't beg for soup, and it never once complained about the cold. It was warm, well-fed, and everywhere. While London's poor starved, the rats lived their best lives. The good news, someone was eating well. The bad news, it wasn't you. The slums of London were the rats' empire, a glittering kingdom of filth, damp, and edible surprises. The creatures ruled beneath the floorboards and behind the walls, thriving on the city's endless buffet of waste. Every alley, drain, and cellar was a banquet hall. If London was the heart of an empire, the rats were its pulse, relentless, gnawing, and impossible to ignore. When food ran short for humans, it only became more abundant for rats. The city's markets overflowed with what the poor couldn't afford, and what couldn't be sold was dumped. Half-rotten vegetables, fish guts, spilled meat, crumbs of bread gone black. At night, the cobblestones glittered faintly with frost and rat eyes. They scurried through the streets in packs, bold as landlords, their tails sketching signatures in the snow. Rats were the great equalisers of Victorian society. They haunted both palaces and prisons, though they preferred the poor, not out of class loyalty, but opportunity. In the East End, you didn't so much live with rats as compete with them. They ate your food, your candles, your soap, and occasionally your toes if you stayed still too long. Every tenement had its stories. Families woke to find gnawed bread crusts, vanished potatoes, or squeaking wars under the bed. Children threw shoes at shadows and learned to sleep with their heads under the blanket, not for warmth, but protection. Rats nested in straw mattresses, turned cracks in walls into doorways, and held midnight parades across the rafters. They were so common that lodgers sometimes gave them names: Old Whiskers, the Colonel, or that bastard in the pantry. The winter made things worse. As temperatures dropped, rats moved indoors, seeking the same warmth humans did. You'd hear them before you saw them, the scratch of claws, the soft squeal of negotiation. They were social animals, which meant they never travelled alone. One rat was a warning, 2 meant you were being sized up, 3 or more, and congratulations, you'd been colonised. The city tried to fight back. Rat catchers were Victorian celebrities of a sort, grimy heroes armed with sticks, traps, and tiny dogs. They worked the streets like bounty hunters, dragging sacks that wriggled ominously. The most famous among them was Jack Black, rat catcher to Her Majesty, who boasted of capturing thousands and kept a few as pets. He even dressed them in ribbons and sold them to ladies as novelty animals. Nothing says civilized society quite like turning vermin into jewellery. Poisons existed, but they were risky. Arsenic worked on rats, and also, inconveniently, on humans. Many families discovered this the hard way as their bread shared the same shelf as the rat bait. Traps were safer but cruel, and you had to own one first, a luxury in itself. Most people relied on cats. Those slum cats had a work ethic similar to philosophers. They'd watch rats scurry by with detached interest, clearly thinking, I'm unionised. Still, rats provided a strange companionship. In the silence of night, their rustling was almost reassuring, proof that something in the room was alive. They were survivors, like their human neighbours, cunning and tireless. Both species lived on scraps, feared the cold and avoided the upper class. It was, in a morbid way, solidarity. Of course, not everyone was sentimental. Rat hunting became a spectator sport in taverns and warehouses. Men bet money on dogs set loose in pens swarming with rats, cheering as the animals tore through the writhing pile. It was violent, filthy, and wildly popular. The perfect summary of Victorian entertainment. Winners took home pride, the dogs took home fleas. But despite the efforts, the rats always won. They bred faster than landlords raised rent. Every litter meant another generation ready to inherit the slums. The Thames carried them by the thousands, ferrying tiny pioneers into new neighbourhoods. They rode on carts, climbed ships, and occasionally showed up in polite society's parlours, prompting screams and editorial outrage about urban decay. The authorities blamed the poor, naturally. Unclean habits, they said, as if poverty itself invited rodents. They ignored that the sewers overflowed, the streets stank, and the housing inspectors worked part-time. The rats were not symptoms, they were citizens. London was built for them, just accidentally. Winter was their festival. When the frost locked away everything else, the rats remained undeterred, slipping through drains, nesting in coal piles, stealing crumbs from sleeping mouths. They were the only ones who seemed to thrive on scarcity, as if they'd found a way to turn misery into a business. And in their way, they were perfect Victorians, industrious, adaptable, and utterly shameless. The good news, something was alive in your house. The bad news, it had better furniture than you. Victorian London did not believe in childhood as we understand it. There were no snowball fights, no cocoa by the fire, no cheerful Dickensian romps through the frost, unless you count running barefoot to the factory at dawn. For the poor, childhood wasn't about playtime. It was about keeping all 10 fingers attached. The city's smallest workers were its most exploited, and winter was the cruelest season of all. When the frost came, children didn't huddle indoors. They trudged through it, working jobs that turned their bones to ice and their lungs to cinders. Some swept chimneys before sunrise, others hauled coal, sold matches, or worked in factories so cold their breath froze on the looms. Childhood was a luxury item, and no one in the East End could afford it. By law, children were supposed to be in school. By necessity, they were on the streets. Chimney sweeps began as young as 5. The smaller you were, the more employable. A thin child could crawl through a flue barely wider than a coffin, scraping soot with a brush until they emerged blackened and shaking, rewarded with a few pennies and a lungful of dust. In winter, the soot clung to sweaty skin and froze into a second filthy skin. Boys slept wrapped in old sacks by the fire, their burns crackling like the coals they envied. Factory children fared little better. The textile mills of Southwark and the dock warehouses of Limehouse ran year-round. There were no snow days, only slower productivity. The air inside was a choking fog of lint and cold steam. Windows were sealed shut to trap the heat of the machinery, but it never reached the workers. Fingers went numb, slipped on metal, and sometimes vanished entirely. No one paused the loom for screams. The foreman's only comment might be, "Less talking, more spinning." Outdoor jobs were even worse. Crossing sweepers, mostly boys and girls under 12, spent their days clearing slush from carriageways with brooms taller than they were. Their wages depended on the generosity of passers-by, which, in London winter, was about as common as sunshine. The slush they swept wasn't snow so much as a chemical soup of mud, horse dung, and mystery fluids. It soaked through their boots, if they had any, and froze between their toes. Many ended the day with frostbite, or without the toes. Then there were the match girls, the fragile army of teenagers selling matches door to door, or working in match factories where phosphorus gnawed their jaws and the cold stiffened their hands. Their thin dresses offered little protection from wind that sliced through the city like debt collectors. "Keep smiling," one was told by her overseer. "People don't buy matches from ghosts." She tried, until the cold turned her smile into a grimace. Newspaper boys fanned through the streets before dawn, shouting headlines through clouds of their own breath. Their voices cracked from cold and exhaustion long before puberty. Some fainted mid-call and were stepped over by the crowd. Newsprint ink bled onto their fingers and into their mouths when they bit the pages to tear them. "A taste of current affairs," they joked grimly. And yet somehow children still found scraps of mischief. In alleys they played with whatever the city threw away, a broken wheel, a stick, a frozen potato. Laughter, when it came, echoed sharply in the cold, defiant and fleeting. Even the cruelest winters couldn't quite freeze their spark. One reformer visiting Whitechapel wrote, astonished, that a group of barefoot boys were playing marbles with coal lumps and laughing like angels. The boys later admitted they were just trying to stay warm. The charities noticed, of course. Well-meaning Victorians loved to photograph poor children, ideally with the just enough dirt on their faces to look inspiring. They called them street urchins, a word that made poverty sound quaint instead of terminal. Soup missions offered bread and sermons. Ragged schools offered lessons when work allowed. But once the lessons ended, the children went right back to labour, because the rent collector didn't care about arithmetic. The danger wasn't only in the cold, but in what the cold did to time. Winter stretched endlessly for these children. A season of frozen fingers, aching hunger, and perpetual dusk. Many didn't live long enough to see adolescence. The lucky ones grew into adults who no longer felt their feet because they'd lost them long ago. Still, there was resilience in every frostbitten grin. These children learned early that survival was an art form. They wrapped rags around their hands, stuffed straw in their shoes, and kept moving. To stop was to die. And in that movement, that grim, determined shuffling through the ice, they built the rhythm of a city that pretended not to see them. Victorian London called them the future of the empire. The irony was that the empire already owed them everything. Its soot, its labour, its heartbeat. The good news, you survived another shift. The bad news, childhood was the one job you'd never get back. London has always been a city of smells, a grand olfactory experiment that began with good intentions and ended in self-defence. But in winter, the scent of Victorian London didn't fade, it evolved. The heat didn't burn it away, it preserved it. Pickled it in fog and frost until the whole city reeked like a monument to survival. It smelled like progress, failure, and someone boiling the mouths. When the first frost rolled in, the air changed character. In summer, the stench was warm and alive. Rotting food, horse dung, sweat, sewage, and optimism. In winter, the same ingredients froze and fused into something new. A cold metallic funk that clung to wool coats and refused to die. The wind carried the city's resume of smells right into your nostrils, each whiff a reminder that civilization was, at best, an ongoing experiment. At street level, the cocktail began with coal smoke. Every house that could afford it burned coal constantly, to cook, to heat, or simply to pretend life was tolerable. The smoke poured from chimneys in thick, greasy clouds, and mixing with the fog until the two were indistinguishable. It stung eyes, blackened laundry, and turned the air into soup. Londoners called it pea soup fog, which was optimistic branding for something that tasted like ash and phlegm. People coughed through it politely, because in Victorian society, even choking was done with restraint. Coal didn't just fuel fireplaces. It powered the city itself. Factories, trains and gasworks all belched their contributions to the bouquet. The Thames, sluggish and sullen, absorbed the overflow. Soot, sludge, and everything else the city didn't want to think about. When it froze, the smell didn't go away. It just waited. A thaw brought it back with interest. Then there was the sewage. London's drainage system in the mid-1800s was less an engineering marvel and more a polite suggestion. Much of it flowed directly into the river or onto the streets, where it froze in picturesque puddles. Under a light dusting of snow, you could never be sure whether you were stepping on ice or last week's plumbing failure. The frost turned filth into architecture, glistening heaps of frozen excrement like accidental sculptures of civic neglect. When they thawed, the city learned that memory has a smell. Every layer of London had its own scent profile. The East End smelled of poverty and boiled cabbage. The docks smelled of fish, brine and labour. The upper-class districts, smug on their hills, smelled faintly of perfume and hypocrisy. But in winter, the wind was democratic. It carried the stench from the river banks and alleys right up to the drawing rooms of Kensington. The rich called it unpleasant weather. The poor called it Thursday. Clothing, too, had its own ecosystem of odours. Damp wool was the unofficial fragrance of the season. Once wet, it never fully dried, and every household carried the smell of steamed sheep. Add to that the scent of unwashed bodies, mouldy walls, and overworked boots, and you had an aroma scientists still struggle to classify. Soap was expensive, laundry water froze, and cleanliness was often replaced with cologne. Or, failing that, prayer. Public spaces were their own sensory gauntlets. The markets were pungent museums of mortality. Butchers' stalls dripped with blood that froze mid-drip. Fishmongers shouted over piles of cod stiff as planks, and vegetable sellers offered produce that looked as tired as their customers. The cold slowed decay but didn't stop it. It just made everything smell faintly of tragedy. Even churches weren't immune. Packed pews of damp coats and unwashed faithful created a holy haze that mingled incense with humanity. One observer joked that London's cathedrals smelled like God's mercy and someone's feet. And then, of course, there were the horses. London ran on horsepower, and horsepower ran on oats, which meant the streets ran on horse droppings. In winter, the dung froze into neat, slippery tiles that thawed into disaster by midday. The smell was omnipresent, sour and sweet at once, a perfume that even the Queen couldn't ignore. It clung to boots, clothing and dreams. There were moments when the city almost smelled pleasant, brief, delusional whiffs of roasted chestnuts or baking bread. A bakery vent could transform a freezing alley into a fleeting paradise. The scent of warm dough drifted through the soot, mingling with coal smoke like a promise life didn't intend to keep. People stopped just to inhale, closing their eyes, pretending for 1 second they weren't breathing the same air as the Thames. But the true scent of winter London was contradiction. Death disguised as industry, rot disguised as progress. Reformers wrote essays about improving the city's air, while entrepreneurs sold smog masks made from wire and gauze. One inventor even proposed pumping perfume into the streets through the gas lamps. The idea failed spectacularly, proving that even lavender can't compete with raw sewage. For the poor, smell wasn't just an inconvenience, it was identity. It marked you. The stench of labour followed the working class everywhere, in their hair, their clothes, their bums. You could bathe, but the city clung. It was said that you could tell a man's trade by the way he settled. Coalman, fish porter, tanner or tailor. For most, winter didn't cleanse, it just froze the evidence. When spring finally came and the thaw began, the city exhaled, and everyone regretted it. The frozen filth released its memories, the river groaned back to life, and the smell of London reasserted itself like an old landlord demanding rent. The good news, the cold dulled your sense of smell. The bad news, it always came back before your appetite did. Factories in Victorian London were built for profit, not comfort. Temples to industry where the only thing that got warmed up was the machinery. In winter, these vast iron caverns turned into human refrigerators humming with noise, smoke and the faint collective wish for death. The walls sweated condensation, The windows frosted from the inside and the air had all the charm of a wet boot. Factories weren't heated, but at least your body was warmed by the fires of mild despair. The logic was simple. Heat cost money and workers didn't. Employers believed cold sharpened efficiency and discouraged idleness. What it actually encouraged was frostbite and swearing. Still, the work went on. Before dawn, the labourers trudged through icy streets to reach their stations, spinning mills, textile houses, match factories, yeast, tanneries, foundries, each one colder than the last. The steam from their breath mingled with the smoke of machines until the air itself seemed exhausted. Inside, the temperature hovered somewhere between meat locker and morgue. Windows were sealed to trap the heat that didn't exist. Iron tools froze to the touch. Workers wrapped rags around their hands just to pick them up. Men wore their coats all day and women worked with shawls tight around their shoulders, their skirts stiff from damp. If you dropped your tools, they clanged on the floor and stuck to the ice that formed there overnight. It was less place of employment and more interactive polar exhibit. Factories ran on routine, endless, mechanical, merciless. The cold made everything slower except the overseer's tempers. If production lagged, it was never because the oil froze or the machinery seized up, it was because the workers were deemed lazy. "Move faster," they'd shout, as if sheer enthusiasm could thaw metal. One worker later recalled, "It was so cold I could see my breath on the bobbins." She kept spinning anyway, because if she stopped, the day's pay vanished. Steam-powered mills were the worst paradox of all. You'd think the presence of boiling water might make things warmer, but instead it filled the air with cold humidity that seeped into bones and lungs. Workers coughed their way through fog so thick they couldn't see the far end of the room. The sound of machines never stopped. A thunder of gears, belts, and hissing pistons that made conversation impossible. If you screamed, the noise politely ignored you. In the match factories, girls sat for hours at long tables, dipping sticks into phosphorus that fumed in the cold. Their hands went numb, then burned, then numbed again. You could always tell when a girl was freezing, one inspector wrote, for she ceased to smile, which, given the circumstances, seemed like a perfectly logical reaction. Metal workers and foundrymen faced their own version of winter's cruelty. The furnace room was hot enough to scorch your eyelashes, but step 2 feet away and you could see your breath again. Workers alternated between freezing and roasting, their bodies constantly at war with the temperature. One side of your face baked, the other froze solid. It was the industrial equivalent of emotional whiplash. The floor was its own battlefield. Water from leaks and spills froze overnight, turning the workroom into an ice rink of hazards. Slip, fall, and you might lose more than your dignity. Machinery didn't stop for clumsiness. The saws, looms, and presses ran on schedules stricter than the 10 Commandments. Many factories posted cheerful reminders like "time is money," which was rich coming from people who paid by the hour in shillings. There were no gloves provided, no breaks for warmth, and certainly no sympathy. A cup of weak tea or a chunk of bread was considered adequate insulation. The cold crept into bones and never quite left. Old workers limped with factory rheumatism, a souvenir of decades spent producing wealth for others. Children drafted as assistants grew up bent and coughing, their growth stunted by malnutrition and steel. The younger ones, nimble enough to crawl under running machines, were expected to keep them oiled, regardless of how frozen their fingers were. If they didn't move fast enough, well, there was always another child outside looking for work. When one factory owner was asked why he didn't heat his building, he reportedly replied, "The men make heat enough with their bodies." That was true. The heat of friction, exhaustion, and quiet fury. The human furnace burned slowly, fueled by necessity. And yet, even in these frozen fortresses, humour survived. Workers told jokes between shivers, swapped gloves when one pair wore through, and sang songs over the rhythm of machines. Laughter echoed strangely in those vast rooms, brittle but defiant, proof that the cold couldn't quite freeze the spirit. We made cloth for the ladies, one spinner recalled, and frost for ourselves. When the whistle finally blew, the day's end offered little relief. The workers trudged home through sleet and soot, their bodies sore. Their clothes reeking of oil and smoke. They returned to unheated lodgings and half-empty plates, only to rise before dawn and do it all again. London's factories didn't care for comfort, only production, but the people inside them, numb and shivering, kept the city alive. The good news? The machinery never stopped running. The bad news? Neither did your nose. In Victorian London, poverty wasn't just endured, it was observed. The middle and upper classes turned misery into a sightseeing attraction, and the slums became their favourite destination. Under the noble banner of philanthropy and moral improvement, they ventured into the East End armed with notebooks, fur-lined coats, and just enough pity to feel virtuous without actually helping. Nothing says compassion like writing about poverty from inside a fur-lined carriage. The Victorians adored the performance of empathy. Reform was fashionable, charity, a social accessory. Ladies of good breeding hosted tea parties to raise funds for the deserving poor, a phrase that implied some suffering. People had better manners than others. Men formed committees to discuss the problem of starvation over brandy and cigars. Meanwhile, the poor continued starving, quietly, so as not to interrupt the minutes of the meeting. Every winter, London's slums turned into theatres of benevolence. Carriages rolled into Whitechapel and Bethnal Green, their wheels crunching over frost and refuse. Out stepped society's best and brightest, clergymen, reformers, and curious socialites, ready to witness the conditions firsthand. The conditions, naturally, were appalling. That was the point. The visitors wanted filth, darkness, and moral decay. The worse it smelled, the more inspired their sermons would sound later. Guides, often local policemen or church workers, led these slum tours through narrow alleys with the enthusiasm of museum docents. And here, one might announce, gesturing dramatically to a heap of shivering humanity, we have the gin-soaked mother and her unfortunate children. Note the lack of ventilation and the moral decline. Guests nodded, horrified, while holding perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces. A few even took notes. Poverty, after all, looked excellent in print. Writers and reformers turned these visits into bestsellers. Charles Booth mapped London's misery by colour code, documenting the submerged 10th. Henry Mayhew interviewed beggars and chimney sweeps like an anthropologist cataloguing a newly discovered species. Their work did expose injustice, but it also satisfied a deep middle-class curiosity. What do the poor smell like up close? The answer was worse than the book describes. Philanthropy came with rules, of course. The worthy poor were those who worked hard, prayed often, and didn't drink gin. The unworthy poor were everyone else. Compassion was conditional. A mother could receive coal or soup if she proved sufficiently repentant about her poverty. The slightest whiff of vice, or whiskey, and the door shut firmly in her face. Victorian morality wasn't about helping the helpless, it was about policing them into better manners. The city teemed with missions, reform houses, and institutes for moral uplift. Some did genuine good, feeding children, offering education, or sheltering the destitute. But others were more interested in spiritual hygiene than physical comfort. Their tracts warned that sin was the root of cold and hunger, and salvation was the only true cure. One pamphlet declared, "The poor must be washed clean of both filth and bad habits." The poor, reading this, likely wished someone would start with the filth. Charitable ladies in bustles distributed blankets, pamphlets, and unwanted advice. They tutted at bare feet, gasped at damp walls, and offered prayers that sounded suspiciously like performance art. Afterward, they returned to their parlours to write letters describing the terrible conditions of the deserving classes, usually while their servants froze in the scullery. Nothing eased guilt like a good essay. There was also the curious habit of posing with the poor. Early photographers, invited along on these benevolent expeditions, staged portraits of reformers surrounded by ragged children. The children rarely smiles, not out of misery, but because holding still for 40 seconds in freezing weather is difficult when your coat is imaginary. The resulting images made excellent parlour conversation pieces. Ah, yes, here I am, standing beside destitution itself, and such a humbling experience. Even Dickens, the champion of the downtrodden, became part of this voyeuristic compassion industry. His novels gave the middle class a safe way to cry about poverty without ever encountering it. Readers wept over Oliver Twist while sipping hot tea in rooms lit by coal fires. Empathy sold well, provided it came with a plot twist and didn't require actual contact with the poor. The poor, for their part, learned to play the game. They knew how to look appropriately pitiable, eyes down, voice soft, hands trembling, just long enough to secure a blanket or loaf of bread. They called the wealthy visitors angels, though the word was used with a distinct absence of wings. A few even mocked the tours, greeting carriages with exaggerated bows or improvised performances of tragic wailing. If you were going to be someone's moral lesson, you might as well make it entertaining. Yet not all philanthropy was hollow. Some reformers truly cared. They built schools, opened hospitals, and fought for better laws. But even they couldn't escape the paternalism of the age. The poor weren't treated as citizens to be uplifted. They were patients to be managed. London's compassion, like its fog, was thick, uneven, and slightly toxic. When the carriages finally rolled away, the slum settled back into silence. The frost crept over the cobblestones again. The same families huddled in the same corners, only now they smelled faintly of lavender from the handkerchiefs their visitors had waved. Charity had arrived, observed, and departed, leaving warmth only in the reports soon to be read aloud at dinner parties. The good news? London cared enough to look. The bad news? It kept looking from a safe distance. Christmas in the slums of Victorian London was a performance of joy on a stage built from frost and exhaustion. For the wealthy, the season meant goose dinners, plum puddings, and roaring hearths. For the poor, it meant a slightly different miracle, that one day out of the year the city almost remembered they existed. Christmas spirit came in small doses, like the brandy. In the East End, December didn't smell of pine and cinnamon. It smelled of coal smoke, cabbage water, and the faint tang of desperation dressed up in tinsel. Till even the poorest families tried to celebrate. They scrubbed their rooms, patched their clothes, and called it decorating. A sprig of holly in a cracked bottle counted as luxury. A candle that burned past supper was an extravagance. Children strung bits of coloured paper or dried orange peel into garlands, pretending they were as grand as the trees glittering in Kensington windows. The Victorians had reinvented Christmas as a moral event, a time for generosity, family, and the occasional sermon about not drinking too much. The middle class loved to give, publicly and ideally with witnesses. Charitable dinners sprang up across the city, vast halls where hundreds of the poor queued for a plate of roast beef or more often gruel with festive aspirations. Reformers called them feasts of Christian kindness. The guests called them Tuesday but louder. Still, those dinners mattered. For one night the soup had flavour. A thin slice of meat, a crust of bread, maybe even a spoonful of pudding. It was enough to make the city feel almost human. Church bells rang, choirs sang, God rest ye merry gentlemen, and for an hour or two the frost outside seemed a little less cruel. The attendees bowed their heads for grace, aware that this might be their only warm meal until spring. The churches were the heart of Charity Christmas. Mission halls hung banners that read, "Peace on earth," goodwill to all men, though all men often excluded those with gin on their breath. Children received second-hand toys, dolls missing limbs, or wooden horses with 3 legs, each gift wrapped in brown paper and the moral instruction. Volunteers handed out oranges, an exotic luxury that symbolised both generosity and mild confusion. Is it food or perfume? One East End newspaper reported that the local soup kitchen dispensed cheer to over 1,000 grateful souls. The same article added, somewhat less cheerfully, that several fainted from hunger before the line reached the door. Even Charity had a queue. Not everyone trusted organised benevolence. Many of the poor preferred to celebrate at home, or what passed for home. Families pooled pennies for a small loaf, a dab of dripping, or a single candle. Mothers made puddings out of bread. Treacle and blind optimism. Fathers sold their coats for a half bottle of gin to warm the spirit, and for a few hours the slums shimmered with forced festivity. Laughter echoed off the damp walls, brittle but real. Street life also had its own kind of celebration. Hawkers called out holiday bargains, hot chestnuts, penny pies, toys for the little ones, while the cold gnawed at their fingers. Children stared at shop windows displaying mechanical toys, sugar, mice, and gleaming oranges they'd never touch. Yet they smiled anyway, because the magic of Christmas was contagious, even when you couldn't afford it. Public houses overflowed. The pubs were the poor man's church, warm and noisy and full of questionable carolling. Men raised cheap ale to toast survival, while women sang songs loud enough to drown the wind. For many, Christmas was the one night they could afford to forget the rent, the hunger, the frost creeping under the door. Just for a while the world was drunk enough to seem kind. Of course, reformers wrung their hands about it. Intemperance, they warned, is the true enemy of Christmas. The poor nodded politely, then ordered another pint. After all, sermons didn't thaw you out, but gin did. Children were the beating heart of the slum Christmas. No matter how little there was, parents tried to make the day special. A crust of sugared bread could become a feast, a found ribbon a treasure. Some street performers, clowns, fiddlers, and amateur Santas, wandered the alleys, trading laughter for pennies. They wore red coats borrowed from military surplus and beards made from cotton, or pure confidence. For a few fleeting hours, magic wasn't just for Mayfair. Yet when the night ended, the illusion melted faster than snow on a coal grate. The leftovers vanished, the fires died, and the city returned to its usual chill. The charities packed up their ladles, the reformers congratulated themselves on their compassion, and the slums sank back into silence. But for one day, one improbable, candle-lit day, London had been united by warmth, however unevenly distributed. Christmas in the slums wasn't about presents or plenty. It was about pretending. Pretending the world could be kind, that hunger could wait, that tomorrow wouldn't come so quickly, and for the poor that was enough. The good news, the Christmas pudding had raisins this year. The bad news, so did the walls. February arrived not with relief but with a slow, squelching sense of betrayal. After months of bitter cold, London woke to find its icy prison melting, and immediately wished it hadn't. The frost loosened its grip, the ice cracked, and the city discovered that beneath winter's glittering misery lay something far worse. Water. Congratulations. You survived the cold. Now enjoy your new indoor pond. The thaw didn't happen all at once. It began stealthily, with dripping eaves and the faint sound of trickling gutters that hadn't made a noise since December. At first, people rejoiced. At last, they said, the freeze is breaking. But by midday, the streets had turned into shallow rivers of filth, and by nightfall, half the city smelled like a forgotten laundry basket. The ice that had sealed in London's sins now dissolved, releasing every odour, puddle and rat it had politely kept frozen for months. The Thames, once a shining road of ice, began to groan like an old debtor remembering unpaid bills. Huge slabs broke apart, drifting downstream with slow menace, carrying with them barrels, dead animals, and the occasional piece of unlucky furniture. Barges that had been trapped in place all winter were finally freed, only to crash into one another as the current surged. The river didn't flow so much as collapse forward, and when it did, it brought with it all the refuse London had been pretending didn't exist. In the slums, the thaw was both liberation and disaster. For months, the ground had been frozen solid. No mud, no sewage, no movement. Now it all returned with enthusiasm. The alleys filled with water that refused to drain, turning tenements into islands. Children splashed through ankle-deep puddles of questionable heritage. while adults tried to build barriers of bricks, rags, and blind optimism. Cellars flooded first, then kitchens. Beds that had once been cold and hard were now cold, hard, and damp. The smell was indescribable. The melting snow released every secret it had been keeping. Spoiled food, waste heaps, dead animals, and, in some cases, less fortunate residents. It was as if winter had been storing all the city's sins in ice. And now London had to smell its own confession. The newspapers tried to find the poetry in it. One described it as the gentle unfreezing of life. The people living in East End basements described it less gently. Even the city's infrastructure groaned under the thaw. Cobblestones lifted from their beds like bad teeth. Water burst through cracked pipes, and horse carts sank into unexpected puddles the size of ponds. The police reported multiple incidents of people vanishing into holes that had once been roads. Meanwhile, the newly freed gutters carried torrents of brown water downhill, sweeping away everything from soot to sanity. Factories fared no better. Flooded floors turned into mirrors of despair, and machinery rusted faster than the workers' patience. Mills had to shut down until the water receded, which meant unemployment just as quickly as the frost melted. The lucky ones found temporary work shoveling slush, a job that paid by the puddle. And then there was the ice itself, that treacherous in-between state. Not quite gone, not quite safe, streets glittered in the morning, inviting the unwary to step confidently onto what looked like solid ground. The result was a daily symphony of slips, curses, and bruised dignity. Horse-drawn carts slid sideways, their cargo of turnips or coal flying in every direction. Pedestrians clung to lampposts as if the city itself were tilting. The thaw was not so much an end as an insult. The wealthy complained about the dreadful damp ruining their boots and wallpaper. The poor simply moved their belongings onto higher furniture and hoped for the best. Laundry, which had been impossible to dry during the freeze, was now impossible to keep clean. Even the rats seemed confused, evicted from their cosy winter nests. They swam aimlessly through flooded cellars like tiny, miserable sailors. The churches tried to find the moral in it all. The thaw, one preacher declared, reminds us that even hardship must one day melt away. His congregation nodded politely while wringing out their sleeves. Reformers wrote that the flooding revealed the need for better sanitation and drainage. The government promised to investigate as soon as the drawing room stopped smelling like the Thames. But amidst the chaos, there was strange relief. The air softened. The sun occasionally dared to appear. People stood outside again, blinking like bears emerging from hibernation. The sound of dripping, once annoying, became almost comforting, proof that something was changing. Children played in puddles with the enthusiasm of explorers discovering new continents. For the first time in months, there was movement in the air that didn't bite. Still, survival didn't mean comfort. Boots rotted, walls wept, and the coughs of winter deepened into the illnesses of spring. Doctors reported a rise in pneumonia, influenza, and fevers of the damp, but the poor were too busy mopping, shoveling, and swearing to notice. London's thaw was a civic baptism, unpleasant, overdue, and unlikely to take. By late February, the city was officially unrecognisable. Half flooded, half fogged, all smell. The frost had departed, but the cold left souvenirs, cracked bricks, leaking roofs, and bones that ached with the memory of ice. Still, people laughed again. It was a damp, miserable, gasping laughter, but laughter nonetheless. Because in London, if you couldn't find joy in suffering, you were doing it wrong. The good news? The frost was gone. The bad news? So was the floor. Winter in Victorian Britain didn't just freeze fingers, it froze the economy solid. The Great Frost turned the wheels of industry into static monuments, and the nation's purse strings into icicles. When the Thames locked up and the ground turned to stone, so too did commerce. Markets halted, wages vanished, and Britain learned a painful truth. Winter didn't just freeze rivers, it froze wages too. By early January, the cold had crippled the machinery of progress. barges that once carried food, fuel and goods sat trapped in the ice, stranded mid-river like stubborn ghosts. The Thames, London's lifeline, had become a glittering blockade. Ships couldn't unload, markets couldn't restock, and warehouses filled with spoiled cargo. The economy, so proud of its steam and industry, suddenly remembered that steam doesn't travel well through ice. Transport was the first to suffer. Canals froze solid, railways warped in the cold, and roads became obstacle courses of ice and horse carcasses. The post arrived late, if at all. Letters trapped in frozen depots, mail carts overturned in snowdrifts. Coal deliveries stopped for weeks, creating a vicious cycle. No coal meant no heat, and no heat meant no work. Bricklayers' mortar froze, carpenters' glue turned brittle, and even the blacksmiths' forges struggled to stay lit. The city's heartbeat, its labour, slowed to a painful crawl. The dockyards were a scene of eerie quiet. Ships from the Empire sat idle, their cargo holds stuffed with tea, sugar and textiles, while dock workers wandered the frozen wharves looking for someone to pay them. With no ships to unload, no goods to haul, and no wages to earn, thousands were suddenly unemployed. Idle hands make mischief, moralists warned, as if frostbite were a lifestyle choice. In the countryside, things weren't any better. The frost that made London picturesque turned farmland into glass. Crops failed across the nation. Potatoes, cabbages and turnips rotted in the ground, while livestock froze in barns. Wheat prices rose, bread prices followed, and the poor discovered that hunger was the one thing that never went out of season. The agricultural workers who might have earned a few shillings harvesting were instead left staring at fields that rang like metal under their boots. For small shopkeepers, the winter was economic roulette. The butcher's meat spoiled, the fishmonger's stock froze, and the grocer's customers stopped coming, not from disloyalty, but because no one wanted to walk across an ice rink just to buy onions. Trade in the market slowed to a shuffle, as vendors huddled behind their stalls like reluctant snowmen. Coins were cold to the touch, and buyers were few. The cost of living, meanwhile, soared. What little coal could still be delivered sold for 10 times its usual price. In some parts of London, desperate residents burned furniture and fences to stay warm. Others turned to the black market, where coal merchants sold suspiciously heavy sacks filled with half ash and half regret. Wood, peat, even old newspapers became valuable commodities. Londoners joked grimly that if inflation kept up, soon they would be burning their wages for warmth. Factories, the supposed engines of empire, sputtered to a stop. The cold gummed up machinery and stiffened the oil. Even when the boilers could be fired, workers struggled to keep their hands from freezing around their tools. Textile mills couldn't process cotton deliveries stuck at icy ports. Foundries couldn't pour metal that refused to melt evenly. The Industrial Revolution briefly looked like it might die of exposure. Employers, predictably, didn't pay for days lost to weather. If the almighty halts production, one owner declared, it is not the duty of management to argue. Workers without wages turned to pawn shops, selling their coats, boots and tools just to buy bread. The irony was sharp. They sold the very means that allowed them to work, a long-term solution to a short-term hunger. Pawn shops became winter's true financial institutions, their counters piled high with the hopes of the working class. The government, naturally, did what governments do best, issued reports. Newspapers filled their pages with alarming conditions among the labouring poor, and Parliament debated the crisis from comfortably heated chambers. Charities called for donations, sermons demanded moral fortitude, and the weather, indifferent as ever, continued to ruin everything. When the frost finally broke, the damage was counted not in degrees but in debts. Wages lost, crops destroyed, ships delayed, families displaced. The thaw brought no relief to the ledgers. Floods ruined what the freeze had spared. The rich complained of inconvenience. The poor counted losses in hunger and illness. Economists wrote essays about the invisible hand, though in February even invisible hands were wearing mittens. Yet through it all, the British sense of stubborn humour endured. Pamphleteers mocked the situation with bitter wit. "We may be starving," one wrote, "but at least the rats are eating well." Cartoonists drew the frost as a pompous old gentleman sitting atop a frozen Britannia, wagging his finger at the economy he'd single-handedly humbled. Even misery could be monetized. Newspapers sold record copies on tales of hardship. By spring the market stirred again, though the scars lingered. The frost had done more than stall commerce. It had exposed the fragility of prosperity itself. For all their factories and empires, the Victorians were still at the mercy of the weather. London's poor didn't need economists to tell them that. They already knew what the statistics meant in human terms: a week without wages, a cupboard without bread, a family without fear. The good news: the frost had finally melted. The bad news: so had the economy. When London froze, the empire shivered. The Great Frost of 1895 wasn't just a local inconvenience, it was a global embarrassment. From India to the Caribbean, colonial newspapers relished every frosty headline from the motherland. The British Empire liked to imagine itself as eternal, unstoppable, and guided by Providence. But now it was guided by weather, and Providence had apparently gone on holiday. When London sneezed, the colonies caught a chill, literally. Across the empire, news of Britain's icy suffering travelled by telegraph, and each transmission carried a mix of pity and amusement. "England locked in ice, Thames frozen solid," read the cable, prompting editors in Bombay, Sydney and Cape Town to print variations of the same joke. At last, the British are learning to keep a stiff upper lip because it's frozen that way. Colonial commentators treated the event like a grand farce, the mighty industrial power of the world brought low by its own weather. The frost disrupted more than London's pride. Shipping delays rippled across the empire's arteries. Britain's ports, encased in ice, left entire colonies waiting for their lifelines. Tea from Ceylon sat in crates at Tilbury docks, growing stale. Coffee from Jamaica waited weeks to unload. Spices from India and silks from China languished in frozen warehouses, while sugar shipments from the Caribbean melted into sticky sludge when the thaw came. It was as if the empire had caught a cold and lost its appetite. Letters, orders, and official documents, the bureaucratic lifeblood of empire, were trapped as well. Colonial governors waiting for instructions from Whitehall discovered that the post was delayed indefinitely. This produced a rare and dangerous phenomenon in British administration: improvisation. In Calcutta, one official reportedly quipped, "London is frozen and we are free. Let us pass as many decrees as we can before the ice melts." For Britain's colonies in the warmer climes, the spectacle was both surreal and satisfying. In Australia, newspapers printed cartoons of frostbitten Londoners bundled in coats thicker than kangaroos, while Sydney basked in midsummer smugness. "Poor old England," one paper teased. "Her empire spans the tropics, yet she can't warm her own toes." Indian papers were more poetic. "The sun that rises over the Raj cannot thaw the frozen heart of London." Colonial writers understood irony when they saw it. Meanwhile, the economic chill in London rippled outward. With ports frozen and demand plummeting, merchants in Calcutta, Cape Town and Singapore saw trade grind to a crawl. Ships idled, dock workers waited, and warehouses filled with goods that couldn't move. The empire's carefully balanced system, raw materials in, finished goods out, suddenly froze mid-breath. Some colonial traders joked that they might as well build snowmen out of unsold cotton. In Canada, however, the reaction was mostly laughter mixed with schadenfreude. Canadians had been enduring winters that made London's look like a spa day for centuries. They wrote letters to British newspapers offering advice on how to deal with frost, mostly suggesting thicker spines and better boots. One Montreal paper bragged, "If Londoners can't handle a little ice, we invite them here to practice." Londoners did not reply, possibly because their ink had frozen. But the frost wasn't just a punchline. It revealed the empire's dependence on its capital in a way few crises had. The colonies sent their riches to London. London sent back goods, orders, and identity. When London stopped, the empire stuttered. Trade stalled, supply chains collapsed, and colonial treasuries waited nervously for funds that would not arrive until the ice melted. British banks, the empire's nervous system, could barely move money between branches. Credit froze alongside the Thames. Even the army and navy felt the chill. Supplies of gunpowder, uniforms, and preserved food were delayed, leaving garrisons short. Soldiers in India joked that, Her Majesty's army fights better when not waiting on frozen biscuits. Naval officers, stranded in dockyards, cursed the ice while colonial fleets waited weeks for orders. The sun might never set on the British Empire, but the frost made sure it rose very slowly. In the colonies, there was also moral theatre. Missionaries used the Great Frost as a metaphor for spiritual decay. Even the motherland freezes when her faith cools, preached one clergyman in Nigeria. The locals nodded politely and went back to enjoying the weather. For much of the empire, the British obsession with ice was simply baffling. How can they rule the world, asked one paper in Calcutta, if they cannot rule their own thermometer? When the thaw finally came, the global supply lines coughed back to life. The ports reopened, the telegrams resumed, and the empire's heartbeat returned to its usual self-assured rhythm. But the frost had left its mark, a tiny crack in the myth of imperial invincibility. The colonies had seen the motherland humbled by weather, and they didn't forget it. Back in London, newspapers thanked the loyal colonies for their patience and concern while conveniently ignoring the laughter that had echoed across oceans. It was the kind of event the empire preferred to file under temporary inconvenience rather than global humiliation. Still, for a few weeks, the empire had looked at its frozen capital and realised the truth. The British Empire might span the world, but it was only as strong as the coal in London's fireplace. The good news? The empire survived the frost. The bad news? Its dignity didn't thaw quite as quickly. When the last icicle finally fell and the streets of London began to steam back to life, the Great Frost of 1895 didn't simply melt away, it froze itself into memory. The Victorians, ever sentimental about their suffering, turned the winter's misery into mythology. It was the year Britain learned that tea doesn't solve everything, but it helps. The frost became legend almost immediately. Newspapers that had spent weeks reporting extreme hardship and public inconvenience now rebranded the whole ordeal as a season of picturesque endurance. Pain, once thawed, became poetry. Artists sketched romantic scenes of ice skating on the Thames and children laughing in the snow, conveniently omitting the parts where people slipped into the river or lost toes to frostbite. Even the Illustrated London News published engravings of cheerful chimney sweeps frolicking under icicles, as though the nation's collective suffering had been sponsored by optimism. Writers, too, couldn't resist the drama. Essays appeared describing London under crystal and the Diamond City, as if the frost had been a divine art installation. Poets compared the frozen Thames to a mirror reflecting the nation's resilience, though anyone who had smelled it knew resilience wasn't the first word that came to mind. Charles Dickens had died years earlier, but his spiritual successors took up the pen, turning every puddle into a moral metaphor. Misery, after all, sold well in serial form. The frost seeped into the Victorian imagination not just as a natural disaster, but as proof of character. Surviving the cold became a badge of Britishness, a test of the national backbone. In pubs and parlours, stories circulated of milkmen delivering through blizzards, lamplighters refusing to abandon their rounds, and families huddling together with cheerful fortitude. By spring, the frost wasn't a failure of infrastructure. It was a triumph of temperament. No other nation, Victorians proudly declared, could freeze quite so politely. The visual arts joined in the myth-making. Painters captured the icy Thames like a frozen Eden, rosy-cheeked Londoners gliding across the surface where ships once sailed. One popular painting, The Frozen Highway, depicted carriages and vendors bustling across the ice in almost carnival fashion. Viewers marvelled at the beauty of it, ignoring that the artist had politely excluded the nearby soup lines. The same cold that killed thousands became, through oil and canvas, the latest trend in drawing room decor. Photography, still relatively young, played its part too. Amateur photographers braved numb fingers to capture eerie black and white scenes of frozen fountains and snow-draped gas lamps. The results looked ethereal, almost peaceful, a world suspended in stillness. Later generations would mistake those photos for serenity, forgetting that the calm came from exhaustion. Folklore, meanwhile, took on a life of its own. Children who'd grown up during the frost told tales of it for decades. The year the river slept, they'd call it. In some districts, old-timers swore that you could still hear the ice creak beneath the bridges on quiet nights, the ghost of the frozen Thames. Parents turned the frost into bedtime cautionary tales. Wear your boots, or you'll end up like the lad who tried to skate to Greenwich. London's humour, as always, leaned toward the morbid. Even politics found a use for the frost. Social reformers cited it as evidence of inequality, the season when the poor froze while the rich painted landscapes about it. Economists wrote reports with titles like On the Pecuniary Consequences of Unseasonable Temperature, which managed to make starvation sound like a scheduling issue. The frost became a moral mirror in which every Victorian saw what they wanted: faith, progress, resilience, or failure. In literature and popular memory, the Great Frost also became a metaphor for modernity itself, the moment when Britain's confidence cracked under the weather. The empire that spanned continents had been humbled by its own climate. It was proof that all the steam power, science, and self-assurance in the world couldn't stop a frozen pipe. Yet the Victorians refused to see it as weakness. They reframed it as proof of endurance, the ability to suffer beautifully. By the turn of the century, the frost had already entered nostalgia's warm embrace. Writers reminisced about the magical winter of old London, conveniently forgetting the hunger, the deaths, and the smell. Tourists could buy postcards depicting cheerful skaters on the Thames, sold with captions like, "A scene from the Great Frost, when London danced on ice." It was history, sanitised and souvenir-sized. Even decades later, the frost lingered in memory, like a chill that never quite left the bones. It showed up in memoirs, in sermons, in songs sung by old costume mongers who'd survived it. The poor who had trudged through that winter never forgot its taste, bitter, smoky, and cold, yet they too told the stories with a kind of grim pride. To have lived through the frost was to have earned a place in the great freezing epic of Britain. And so the frost became part of what Victorians loved most about themselves: endurance wrapped in decorum. They had faced a season that broke bridges, froze rivers, and humbled an empire, and emerged with teacups raised, declaring it all rather invigorating. That was the Victorian way, to turn calamity into character and tragedy into anecdote. The good news? The frost melted, but the legend stayed. The bad news? So did the smell.